Hello and welcome back to another Parry This Arthurian Legend video. Today's topic is of course Sir Kay the Tall, the foster brother of King Arthur, the seneschal of all of Arthur's lands, and one of the greatest knights of arms at the Round Table. This is just the latest in my series of videos, just like this one, covering various characters from Arthurian legend, and I invite you to watch them all. But let's just dive on in and get to know Sir Kay. So just to get things going, let's talk origins. And the origin of this character goes back to the beginning. Sir Kay is one of the original knights of the Round Table, whose origin in the literature can be traced all the way back to the original Welsh source material, meaning that unlike many knights like Percival, Galahad, Tristram, or Lancelot, Sir Kay has been part of the story since the very beginning. And in the beginning, he would be seen as one of, if not the greatest of Arthur's knights, when it came to warrior prowess. That is of course until Sir Gawain, another one of the original knights, would come along, and for hundreds of years be known as King Arthur's greatest knight. But when it comes to Sir Kay, there were few contemporaries in the early days of Camelot. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Kay's story starts in the castle in the Forest Sauvage, where he was raised by his father, Sir Ector, alongside his brother and best friend, Arthur. Growing up, they were educated together, they trained together, and they hunted together. This relationship is arguably the strongest and the longest lasting one that Arthur would ever develop, and this would show throughout Sir Kay's career. At the time of the Great Tournament of London, where it would be decided who should be king of all England, Sir Kay was a freshly made knight at the age of 17, and his page was no other than his brother, the 15-year-old Arthur. It was during this tournament that the young Arthur would pull the sword out of the stone, with the intention of Sir Kay using it in the tournament. However, upon seeing the sword, Sir Kay brought Arthur to their father, Sir Ector, and had Arthur repeat the feat. Upon seeing Arthur once again pull the sword from the stone, Sir Ector and Sir Kay would kneel and pledge fealty to the young king, becoming his first two knights. It was also at this time that Sir Ector would reveal to Arthur that he was, in fact, not actually his biological father, and that Arthur was actually the true-born son of King Uther Pendragon, and Igraine of Cornwall. Then, Sir Ector made only one request of his new king, and that was that his other son, Sir Kay, would be named King Arthur's seneschal, or in other words, the steward of Arthur's kingdom. King Arthur would accept this request, and Sir Kay would hold that office for the entirety of his life. In the several battles that King Arthur's forces would fight to make Arthur High King, Sir Kay played an extremely important role. Being a large, strong, young knight who was particularly skilled with the sword and lance, Sir Kay could hold his own in battle. And under the command of his father, Sir Ector, Sir Kay would fight in every single battle under Arthur's banner. There are multiple references to Sir Kay's bravery and abilities, and in these he would more often than not be fighting odds of nearly 10 to 1, alongside his fellow knight, Sir Bedivere, and they would cut through the enemies like a scythe through wheat, so much so that just their presence on the battlefield would shake even the strongest opponents, even storied men like the King with 100 Knights and King Lot of Orkney. Sir Kay would play such a prominent role in these battles that when King Arthur would be declared king and form the Round Table, Sir Kay would receive the second seat at the table, being named only after his father, Sir Ector. In the early tales, Sir Kay would often be associated with a fellow knight of the time, Sir Bedivere, and the two would share many famous adventures. In the Saga of Kulveik and Olwen, Sir Kay would participate in the quest to win the Hand of Olwen for Kulveik. This quest would include rescuing a famous prisoner known as Mabon ap Modron, and retrieving the beard hairs of a dangerous foe called Dillis the Bearded. And of course, the slaying of two giants, both Yspadaden himself and Wernach the Giant. This quest is the first material where we would see Sir Kay play such a prominent role, but it would be far from the last. Then of course we have the famous quest to defeat the Giant of Mons St. Michael. This giant was a tyrant who was abusing the locals of his small community, a small island town in Normandy. This giant was well known for capturing children to cook and eat them, and then despoiling and eventually eating the women who would come seeking for their children. And lastly, for slaughtering the fathers, brothers, and husbands who would come seeking their families after they had been taken. The giant was also known for rather aggressive tax policies, and as a result, the people were stripped of most of their food and all of their income. All of this put together made this a particularly bad place to live. So one day King Arthur would set out to right this wrong, along with his two most trusted and able knights, those being Sir Bedivere the One-Handed and Sir Kay the Seneschal. Arthur would originally challenge the giant to single combat and hold him at bay for some time, but the villain would prove to be too strong. And just when it appeared that Arthur would lose the fight and be killed, Bedivere and Kay would charge in, and together the three would slay the giant with many great blows. The next major role that we see Sir Kay take part in is the campaign that Arthur would wage against the Emperor Lucius of Rome. So basically in this story, after King Arthur had been declared the King of the Britons and sat as High King of England, this had gained the attention of Rome, who had long since abandoned Britannia. Seeing Arthur's growing wealth and power, the Emperor Lucius saw an opportunity and sought to declare overlordship and demand annual tribute from Arthur. However, King Arthur and his knights did not fold as the Emperor had expected. In fact, King Arthur countered with a claim to the seat of Rome, which he was in theory the true heir to through his father's line. So King Arthur sent the diplomats back to Rome with a demand to surrender and pledge homage to him, or else there would be war. And of course, this led to war. This war, although seemingly hopeless for the small island nation, would end up being particularly one-sided in favor of the Britons, and this would be in large part to the individual valor and the ability of Arthur and his knights, as well as their alliance with the Franks, and the goodwill of the people, which the king and his knights would earn by the many quests and the good deeds that they would accomplish. Sir Kay was no exception. In fact, outside of his valor on the battlefield, which was said to be great, in fact, so much so that in one battle where Arthur was surrounded and nearly killed, Sir Arthur would charge alone against the enemy soldiers, breaking through the line with his horse, which was slain. There, standing back to back with Arthur, Sir Kay would defeat a score of Rome's finest soldiers, until the two were enclosed in a wall of corpses. Later on in this war, Sir Kay would actually end the war early, claiming victory for King Arthur. This would happen when King Arthur sent Sir Bedivere and Sir Kay as a peace delegation to discuss terms with Emperor Lucius, at the Emperor's own request. However, during the negotiations, the Emperor had planned treachery, and had the two knights attacked. Initially unarmed and set against 24 Roman warriors, the two knights would disarm the first that attacked them, and with the weapons they seized would slay all that had attacked them, painting the rocks around them red with blood. Then, out of wrath, for Sir Kay was well known for his hot-headed nature and his quick temper, Sir Kay would actually go on to slay the Emperor himself. When Sir Kay and Sir Bedivere returned to Arthur with the Emperor's banner, they would report what had happened. King Arthur was shocked, both that the truce had been broken, and that Sir Kay had essentially become a regicide, but this would all prove to be a great victory. As it turns out, Lucius was a very unpopular emperor, who had lost every single battle that he had engaged in against the Britons, and the remaining Roman nobles were glad that he was dead, and they immediately sued for peace. They recognized Arthur as their rightful overlord and would declare him emperor and lord protector of Rome in Rome, nearly 2 months after the death of Lucius. Even the Pope would then anoint both Arthur and his knights, including Sir Kay, as heroes of Rome and God's chosen knights. After this, Arthur's forces returned home victorious, with Arthur essentially being the first Holy Roman Emperor. At times it is said that Sir Kay was unpredictable and had a cruel and even violent temper, but he was Arthur's guardian and one of his most faithful companions. As previously mentioned, Sir Kay was King Arthur's seneschal, which meant that he would govern Arthur's lands and deal with much of the day-to-day administration. He was responsible for much of the law reforms and tax policies of the time. How successful he was is relatively easy to determine, seeing as King Arthur was seen to be the best and most popular king of the Britons, and this would come in large part as a result of Sir Kay's policies, and the way that justice would be upheld in the kingdom. Sir Kay would also long serve as King Arthur's right hand in tournaments, quests, and even in battle, where he was the head of King Arthur's household guard, the elite cavalry unit that Arthur would take everywhere he went. As such, Sir Kay was often a participant and usually a victor in many tournaments throughout the years. Sir Kay would eventually marry Androvette, daughter of King Cador of Northumberland. This marriage was a difficult one to secure, as at the time the relations between King Arthur's kingdom and the kingdom of Northumberland were tense to say the least. And on top of that, Androvette's father had intended to use her as a political tool, having her marriage guarantee him a neighboring king's support, potentially in a war against Arthur. However, Sir Kay would ruin this when he and Androvette would fall in love with each other at a tournament. At this tournament, Androvette would offer her favor to Sir Kay, and he would defeat all comers at the list. The king was reluctant to offer his daughter's hand in marriage, especially to one of his enemy's key commanders, so he insisted that Sir Kay complete a quest first. This quest was one that many knights had tried and failed, and involved retrieving a shield from a lake in Northumberland. This shield was protected by a guardian of the forest, who had never been defeated. Sir Kay would defeat the Guardian, first by solving a series of riddles, and then by just straight up killing it when it refused to let him pass. After this, the king had no option but to give Sir Kay his daughter's hands, and the two were wed. The two would go on to produce two sons, Garawnwyn and Granosys, both tall and strong men who would become great warriors and future knights in Arthur's service, and a beautiful daughter named Celamon, who would marry an Irish prince. Some sources, particularly later ones, say that Sir Kay was a Saxon, but unlike the heathen Saxons because he was a Christian. This story is of course contested by the Welsh, who would claim that Sir Kay was as Briton as any of Arthur's knights, and that his heritage was purely of Welsh descent. However, none of the tales disagreed that Sir Kay was a devout Christian. Sir Kay's death is one that changes a great deal depending on which version of the story is being told. In some tales, he would actually live on after the Battle of Camlan and after Arthur's death, and he would not die until years later. In another, he was actually a member of a group of knights sent on a quest to retrieve the magical scabbard of Excalibur, which had been stolen by Morgan Le Fay, and which would protect King Arthur from most wounds. And there is a story that says that prior to the Battle of Camlan, Sir Kay was actually murdered by the evil knight Sir Mordred, so that he would not be there to protect King Arthur. However, I find that the original story is the one that suits him best. In the original telling, Sir Kay is killed by the villain Gwyddog, who is a longtime enemy of King Arthur. This man, who was no great knight, would lure Sir Kay into a trap by spreading false tales of damsels in distress, and there he would trap Sir Kay and kill him cruelly and cowardly. This he would do to be revenged upon Arthur, whom he knew loved Sir Kay greatly as his own brother, and as his greatest friend. In response, King Arthur himself would go out on his own, with no knights or companions, and he would seek Gwyddog and kill him in single combat in revenge. And in doing so, he would smite Gwyddog's head from his shoulders and cast it away into the woods for the carrion and the wolves, leaving his body for the crows, thus not being buried in consecrated ground, damning Gwyddog to eternal damnation. This being a severe action that Arthur had never taken before and would never take again, not even against Lancelot or Mordred, who would betray him greatly. King Arthur would then retrieve Sir Kay's body and bring it back to Camelot, where he would be buried with honor, at a funeral attended by over 250 of Arthur's greatest knights, many, if not all of whom, were great friends of Sir Kay. And this, my friends, is where Sir Kay's story ends. It is in later tales that Sir Kay would lose many of his best traits and be given many bad ones. This is unfortunately very common in Arthurian legend, as it is common practice for authors to diminish old heroes to make room for new ones. In these later tales, Kay would become stupid, slow, unskilled, and quite frankly, as a bully with a loud mouth. This is disloyal and unfaithful to the character and should not be how this great hero is perceived. As an interesting fun fact, the original depiction of Sir Kay makes him out to be more of a demigod than a knight. This description goes as follows, quote, 9 nights and 9 days his breath lasted underwater. 9 nights and 9 days would he be without sleep. A wound from Kay's sword no physician might heal. When it pleased him, he would be as tall as the tallest trees in the forest. When the rain was heaviest, whatever he held in his hand would be dry for a handbreadth before and behind, because of the greatness of his heat. And when his companions were coldest, he would be as fuel for them to light a fire. Sir Kay was also a famous tournament knight as well as a distinguished combat knight. He would win a great many tournaments in his time, and compete in many great tournaments such as the Great Tournament of London and the Tournament of the Hot Prince. Sir Kay's arms are depicted as either a gold horn on a white field or as 2 large silver keys on a blue field. I believe the first is accurately his arms prior to becoming King Arthur's seneschal and then after Arthur's death, if he lives that long. And the second arms belong to him during his service as Arthur's steward. In modern media, Kay is more often misrepresented than not, but there are a few depictions that I find worthwhile. For example, in T.H. White's first 3 books, The Once and Future King, The Sword and the Stone, and The Queen of Air and Darkness, Sir Kay is treated decently well, oftentimes being mean or at least sharp-witted, but also as a loving foster brother to Arthur. And in one of them, he actually teams up with Robin Hood and Maid Marian to slay a dangerous griffin, so that's pretty fun. In Marion Zimmer Bradley's 1983 The Mists of Avalon, Sir Kay is a loyal and loving brother to Arthur, and is actually depicted rather well, although being maimed and therefore not able to fight as a result of defending Arthur from the Saxons. Just for reference, if you really want to watch something where he is depicted as poorly as possible, just go ahead and watch the 1963 Disney movie, The Sword and the Stone, where he is slow, lazy, boorish, and even a bully to Arthur, whom he treats as less than a servant. In this story, they make Kay out to be the principal villain and foil to Arthur, whom he derisively calls the Wart, unlike earlier stories where this was actually an affectionate nickname for his brother that he loved. And on top of that, they make him out to be totally unskilled with the sword and lance, which helps to finish off this image as a total buffoon incapable of anything but stupidity and cruelty. But that's all that I have time to say about Sir Kay. There's actually a lot more out there about him, but I like to keep my videos down to a certain length, so I've whittled out nearly half of what could have been said about him. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it to be educational and entertaining. But in any case, thanks for watching and have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.